Big Dip is the best ride there.
I know. Why wouldn't you go on it?
Us three are going on it.
You have to.
Okay.
You go there. Well, we're not going there unless we're going on the Big Dipper.
Okay. I'll watch.
Dogs want
you, Les.
Were you going to blow me away in front of my family?
Well, it's looking that way, Les.
Always knew you were a mug, Bennett, but I never thought you'd sink this low.
You know, you're right, Leslie. Never let it be said I'm not a man of honour. Get in the dunny. Back in a moment, kids. Please, Ray. Hope your missus has a good cleaner, Les.
Meet Ray Chuck Bennett, bank robber, criminal mastermind, organiser of the great Bookie Robbery and murderer.
Your daddy was a very bad man.
Ray Chuck Bennett was an extraordinary criminal figure. He planned and pulled off the greatest heist in Australian history, the 1976 Great Bookie Robbery, netting Bennett and his crew over $4 million, equivalent to about $50 million in today's money. Despite his dash and daring, he was also a vicious thug and cold-blooded killer. Bennett and his gangs terrorised the population on 2 continents, robbing them at the point of a gun. Through dramatised scenes, first-hand accounts and psychological analysis of Bennett's life, Australian Crime Stories will give a detailed portrait of a man described as Australia's greatest criminal mastermind.
He was the last of the great armed robbers in Australia. There was Ned Kelly, there was Ray Chuck, and that was that.
He was probably the most dashing crim of his generation, and certainly one that he was feared and admired, generally by police and villains alike. So he was a force to be reckoned with.
Your daddy was a very bad man.
He said, at my time, at the time of my making, in the place where I want to, I'm going to blow your fucking head off.
I want my face to be the last thing you see before you die.
Ray Bennett was a ferocious customer. Ray Bennett was very, very intelligent. He was also extremely vicious, so he was essentially unstoppable.
Ray Chuck Bennett was a painter and docker in Melbourne. He had a history of violence and armed robbery, but he was no ordinary bandit. His daring raids made him something of a cult hero in the criminal world. His robberies were planned with military precision. He trained his crews for weeks in advance. Failure was not an option for Bennett.
Ray Bennett was a ferocious customer, so he was very willing. Ray Bennett was very, very intelligent, so when it came to a complex robbery, like the Great Bookie Robbery, he could find a way.
Well, Ray Bennett grew up in the inner west. He was, you know, a petty crim, really. I mean, he was a painter and docker. He got on those sort of gravy trains down there at the docks. I mean, he graduated from fairly petty crime up to, you know, armed robbery and so forth. He was probably the most dashing crim of his generation, and certainly one that he was feared and admired, generally by police and villains alike. So he was a force to be reckoned with.
He was very good at armed robbery because he used to study, he used to read books about it. And he was fascinated in the life and times of a bloke called Willie Sutton. This Willie Sutton was America's greatest bank robber. He studied the life of Ned Kelly. He studied the life of all the famous bank robbers of history.
Ray Bennett was probably Australia's greatest armed robber. he's up against some fairly illustrious company like Russell Cox, Ian Carroll, Normie Lee, Neddy Smith. But Ray Bennett was one who could find a way where others couldn't.
The Great Bookie Robbery on April the 21st, 1976 was the biggest raid in Australia's history. After Bennett and his gang got away with over $4 million, the standover men of the world of crime came looking for their cut. They came with blowtorches and bolt cutters, ready to torture information out of the gang. It was the Kane brothers who got the closest to the cash. Les and Brian Kane believed the proceeds of the robbery was theirs for the taking, but they hadn't counted on how ruthless Ray Bennett could be.
You know, all this fuss about the bloody Kane brothers, it makes me sick. I mean, Les Kane, he was a psychopath. He'd kill you with a knife or a gun, but if you weren't watching, he'd hit you from behind.
Yeah, he was a terrible piece of shit. He had no compunction about doing anything to anybody, but he didn't have the same nous as Chuck.
He wasn't an armed robber. He didn't take the risks that Bennett had taken, and he just simply wanted his whack of the Great Bookie Robbery. He figured he'd go up and essentially ask for the money.
Well, Les Kane was putting a lot of pressure on Ray Chuck, and then they threatened to come after Ray Chuck's family, and he took shots at Ray Chuck. And so Ray Chuck says, if you want to play that game, I'll play it on you.
Bennett really felt that he wanted to show the Kanes a real lesson in this case, not even give them respect of adhering to the well-established underworld lines.
The lesson would be handed out swiftly and brutally to the Kanes and all the toe cutters and standover men, and the lesson was, mess with Ray Bennett and you're dead.
There are a couple of different versions of this, that the gang had actually infiltrated into Kane's house. They had watched Les Kane come in, they leapt out, grabbed him and shot him with several automatic weapons in his own bathroom. His wife and kids were on hand at the time. They bundled his body into the back of his own pink Ford, and Les nor the car were ever seen again.
Police say Leslie Kane, a former painter and docker, was murdered in his Wantirna home, but his body was never found. 3 men were charged with Leslie Kane's murder: Lawrence Prendergast, Vincent Mickelson, and this man, Raymond Chuck Bennett. All were acquitted.
It wasn't that brutal, big deal. I mean, if Les Kane would have done it to them, he would have shot them in front of their wife and kids. He would have shot their kids first. You know, he was an animal, Les Kane.
Forensic psychologist Stephen Barron believes the murder of Kane was a piece of deliberate brutality designed to enhance Bennett's reputation and ward off any others who wanted a piece of the action.
Killing Kane would have sent the message. Killing Kane in front of his family would have dotted the I's and crossed the T's. It means that I'm not afraid to butcher you in front of your loved ones. In other words, I'm likely to leave your death as a legacy to your wife and kids.
Back in a moment, kids.
Because the grief then is not about the person dying. The grief then is shared by everyone else who is part of that person's family. The grief goes on for years and years, across generations.
It's not just, Les Kane that's got to be dealt with. It's all the people that are loyal to Les Kane. People have got to know that this will go all of the way, and the easiest way to do it is to make it look as ugly as possible so that people get their message real fast.
Raymond Patrick Bennett was born in 1949 in Melbourne. His father, Patrick, was a factory worker, and the family struggled to make ends meet. His mother, Dorothy, or Dot, was a loving mother who always managed to put food on the table, despite the family's difficult financial circumstances. Ray Bennett was the eldest child. He had 2 sisters about whom little is known. Bennett grew up in rented houses in Melbourne's western suburbs. On several occasions, the family faced eviction when his father found himself out of work. Bennett's uncle often came to the rescue. He was a painter and docker, and at one point was the quartermaster sergeant of the Union. Bennett's uncle would lend the family money from time to time to get them back on their feet.
This cycle occurred a number of times in Ray Bennett's life, where he would find himself basically on the streets. It made him, according to Gale, a person who liked to have everything in one place. So when he had his home in Footscray as an adult, he was absolutely sure that his wife and children would be safe there. So they would never have to go through what he went through as a kid.
At that age, he's going to be looking at other kids and seeing what other kids are able to do, and there's going to be a sense of not being able to bring his mates home. The impermanence is going to create some difficulty with him forming close friendships. There'll be a sense of what's different about us. So they become, to a certain extent, clannish, relying on each other, focused inward rather than outward.
At the age of 14, Bennett's uncle got him a job on Melbourne's docks. The work was unrelenting and the pay poor, but for many, especially those with criminal records, it was the only work available.
They'd get out of the boys' homes, they'd get a job. If the factory they were in got broken into, the first thing police do is ask for a list of employees. They go back and check the names against criminal convictions. They go back to the boss. Did you know shithead had a criminal conviction for break and enters? The boss comes down, right, you're sacked. And so after a period of time, the only place that these people can go to get employment is at the painters and dockers. They can't go anywhere else because nowhere else will employ them.
Being in the Painters and Dockers Union at that age would have been very influential because he'd be mixing with people who were engaging in organised, structured crime. People who were engaging in crimes that would sell newspapers because they seemed to be so violent and so excessive. He would have been very strongly influenced by the environment of being in a group of adults who could do what they wanted to, take what they wanted, and smuggle whole containers off the docks.
As a 14-year-old working on Melbourne's docks, Ray Bennett suddenly found himself in the company of Melbourne's most significant criminal figures. The Painters and Dockers Union was the gateway to crime in Melbourne. Some of the dockies were into drug dealing, armed robbery, extortion rackets, hijacking, and even murder. Rival gangs shot and murdered each other for control of the union. Whoever ran the union ran crime in Melbourne. One of the docky scams was ghosting, the practice of collecting pay packets for men who hadn't worked on the docks. It's been alleged that at the height of ghosting, there were up to twice as many pays as there were actual dock workers. An up-and-comer, Ray Bennett, learned the ropes, including having to clock on for some senior members of the Painters and Dockers Union so they'd be paid for work they didn't do.
Oi, did you see Freddie punching on?
Yeah. Yeah, he was in early.
Fucking bullshit, you lying prick. What's he doing here?
No, bullchuck. I got no idea, but I definitely saw him. He said g'day and everything.
Righto.
Come on, let's get over to Flemington.
Alright.
Why the fuck didn't you check to see if the card was punched?
Freddie, Les Kane told me he saw ya.
What the fuck you listening to him for?
It's the last time I do.
Two righties, mate. Two righties. Two righties. Two fucking right.
The union has long been accused of ghosting. Ghosting, in waterfront language, means collecting pay packets for men who haven't worked. According to the bulletin, there are twice as many pay packets as painters and dockers.
Of the 300 members of the Painters and Dockers, these ghost pay packets, they got whacked up amongst about probably 60 dockies. The ones at the top and the ones that are related to the ones at the top and the ones near the top. The other blokes were left painting the ships. Didn't ever look at a ghost pay packet.
There were a lot of good blokes worked down the dock. A lot of blokes had never been in trouble. A lot of blokes that could have written good books were terrified to see anything. They saw nothing. They saw murders and all kinds of violence and whack up of money and jewellery and that, but you could never get them to open their mouth. They weren't bad blokes, they just surviving because they were fellas that came through the Depression, no education, no hope.
Forensic psychologist Chris Lennings believes the painters and dockers provided the training ground for Bennett's criminal career.
You got a bloke who may not have a lot, he's getting more, there's a certain amount of attractiveness being associated with these heavy dudes, so you're gradually being pulled into, being inculcated into an underworld system, and that, particularly in the painter dockers back then, that was kind of a whole culture. So you're starting to go up the rungs in terms of status, and that can be, very attractive to a young person.
I think he would probably see himself as being an apprentice, in the same way as an apprentice plumber. He's working with people who have a skill, a trade. It's a desirable skill and trade because there's a financial reward as well as social rewards. On the first day, he's making cups of coffee for the boys or getting their lunches. At the end of the first year, he would have moved up to the first tier. At the end of 3 years in that environment, he would have seen himself as being able to graduate into the same kind of structures that the adults lived in.
What the fuck you listening to him for?
It's the last time I do.
2 righties, mate. 2 righties. 2 righties. 2 fucking right.
Bennett's time on the docks exposed him to some of Melbourne's most notorious criminals. He developed the skills and contacts to get him started in a life of crime. By the age of 19, he had already convictions for stealing. At this time, he met Gail Petrie. Bennett and Petrie married. She was just 17 years of age, and he had just turned 20. But she was happy to turn a blind eye to his late nights out. She knew he was no philanderer. He came home with money, and she knew better than to ask where it came from.
When a woman marries a man who is a serious criminal, it's often the way that they would prefer not to know. In Gail's circumstance, it only became known to her after they married. So there's love there, and there's this very strong bond. And really, under those circumstances, she's not going to judge her husband for what he does from that point. So she talks about a household that could go for weeks on end without having any real money coming in, and then there'd be just tons of money. There was this sense of famine to feast, to famine to feast, but she very much took the policy of don't ask, don't tell, I don't want to know.
Ray Bennett was first and foremost a criminal. He understood that from an early age, but he wanted to be more than an everyday street crook. If he was going to be a criminal, he wanted to be the best.
I'd say at 14 to 15 years of age, and from then on, Ray Bennett decided to be, most probably, in his own way, he was the mastermind criminal. He was frightened of nothing. He knew more than the old blokes that had schooled him. And as far as he was concerned, he was #1. And a lot of blokes that worked for him, worked with him and admired him, believed that he was.
It's a natural skill being a bank robber. You've got to have a natural. You just got to have a natural ability to be able to do that. To put together a group of 6 men and say, well, rightio, and lead them into a position where all 6 men are carrying guns, and you say, rightio, someone's to watch the door, someone's to watch the cameras, someone's to stand outside, stand inside, blah, 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 get the money, throw it in the bag, and then out. And we've got 90 seconds to do it in, you know?
Well, he started taking on, banks and armoured cars and safes and all this kind of stuff. So he wasn't frightened to point a gun at someone. He wasn't frightened to kill. He wasn't frightened of police. In fact, one of the toughest detectives of his generation, Brian Murphy, said that Ray Chuck Bennett was the only one he actually feared.
He's most probably the only bloke I've ever worried about. When I say worried, I gave a great deal of respect in relation to what he said to me. And I was aware that he'd be capable of carrying whatever threat he made out.
Like many criminals, Ray Bennett kept his family life and his criminal activities separate. His wife, Gail, was aware of the growing reputation her husband had in the Painters and Dockers Union, but he never spoke of his crimes. Gail often lay awake at night wondering if her husband would come home or if he had been caught in the crossfire of a bloody feud. She was relieved when Bennett told her he wanted to travel to England. Bennett fled to avoid becoming victim of the carnage within the Painters and Dockers Union, but he had another motive. To advance his criminal training, Bennett headed to Europe and hooked up with Patrick Jack Warren and Brian Callahan of the infamous Kangaroo Gang, a group of brazen crooks who smashed and grabbed their way across Europe. But Bennett wasn't really interested in shoplifting. He had bigger plans.
You're a good crook, Chuck. I'd like you to get a bit more involved.
I'm just not a shoplifter, Patrick. I'm a counter jumper. I like it on my own.
Yeah, but you know, with us behind you, there's a lot more opportunities.
No, okay? I don't do smash and grab.
Well, you're gonna have to go back home, or the States. You certainly can't work here.
Straight back to Oz, mate. Too many rozzers with nasty hardware in the States.
Got a plan?
Maybe.
You're not still talking about the Victorian Club?
Maybe.
It's a fucking pipe dream. Every decent crook since Ned Kelly has been thinking about that. No way.
Yeah, you're probably right.
It's a dead set pinch. You'll do 10 years on the roof just fucking thinking about it. You think you can pull this off, don't you?
Maybe.
Do tell Raymond.
Like you'd tell me. It's nothing personal, mate.
Yeah, I know.
Just need one more pull here. Get a little kitty together before I go home.
Well, there is that bank in Ipswich we've been eyeing off. If you'd like the boys to give you a hand, you have my blessing.
Blessing? What, you're the fucking Pope now?
I wouldn't go getting on my knees around here, Chuck. Remember where you are. People might think there's something else going on.
The Kangaroo Gang was a group of thieves who operated in Europe. They were older men, but they were essentially shoplifters. And they would routinely go around Europe and England, helping themselves to goodies from retail stores, department stores, and fill container loads and smuggle them back to Australia, where these items would be resold through various retail outlets. Most
of them were wanted here over other jobs that they'd done, shoplifting sprees that they'd been on, break-ins, not a great deal of violence, and most of them didn't revert to violence when they were over there.
He went over there to hone his bank robbery skills, because he said to me, he said, armed robbers in England, he said, they jump out of the vans with baseball bats and wooden battens. And the people in the payroll bands, they jump out with baseball bats and wooden battens. They're having pitched battles on the street with truncheons. And the people in the vans, they're wearing helmets, and the armed robbers are wearing helmets, you know, and bashing each other with truncheons, no guns mentioned. He said, it's ridiculous. I think he was the first bloke in England to ever use a gun in a payroll. You know, he did a payroll over there and used a gun, used a sawed-off shotgun. There was great panic in the streets over that.
Forensic psychologist Stephen Barron sees Bennett's time in England as his graduation from small-time crook to the criminal mastermind who could plan and execute complex crimes like the great Bookie Robbery.
He would have had his apprenticeship in Australia, he would have graduated, he would have gone to the UK, he would have been taken into these groups because of his Australian background, certainly because of his painter and docker connections. They would have seen him as being trustworthy. He wouldn't have dobbed him into the police. He spoke the same kind of language, he had the same kind of mannerisms, he'd had the same kind of value systems. And because he was Australian, he would have been a welcome addition to any Australian-based crime gang in the UK.
You're a good crook, Chuck. I'd like you to get a bit more involved.
When he's there, I would imagine he sees himself as going into a certain specialised role with people who had a particular niche market in crime. In the same way that a mechanic goes from working on Holdens and Fords and moves into working on Alfa Romeos and Subarus. It's just simply another level of expertise, and certainly something that adds to the status. It would look good in his CV.
Bennett arrived back in Australia into the arms of his loving wife, Gail. Gail had given Ray 2 sons, but with him skylarking across Europe, he had been an absentee father and husband. He promised her all that was going to change, but deep down, she could not believe it.
What happens with the partners in these relationships is that they've got a lot of things to consider. Firstly, the fact is that their partner's involved with associates. There's a lot of force involved in what they do. There's potential for violence. They need to believe that their partner can protect them.
It was a terrifying time whenever he was arrested, and he was arrested on a number of occasions, and was sent to jail on a number of occasions. But she always maintained that whenever she got the opportunity to talk to her husband, even while he was in custody, he would make her feel that everything was going to be all right, that he had a solution and that he would fix it.
Don't forget, sometimes these guys also produce an enormous aura of confidence. They produce an aura of protectiveness. They make the other person feel that no matter what goes down, they will be safe, they will be protected.
Ray Chuck Bennett promised Gail he would always protect the family. This promise led to a dangerous vendetta when Bennett finally crossed paths with Brian Murphy.
Bennett I met in the late 70s. We had a considerable amount of property stolen from Palermo leather goods. We were given the job to go out and investigate it. We worked around the clock for a couple of days and eventually led us to Chuck Bennett's house, and myself and 2 crews of detectives went there. We gained admittance through an open front door. Mrs. Bennett was in the bedroom. I spoke with her, quite a pleasant lady, and little did I know that as a result of being pleasant, I was going to be had allegations against me about the way I treated a baby.
Murphy had done nothing wrong. He'd merely picked up Bennett's infant son and passed him to Gail. But Ray Bennett believed the child had been manhandled, and his response was instinctive: kill Murphy.
Friday night, myself and several other detectives went over to have a pizza at West Melbourne. We were met by Bennett and another friend of his, and Bennett opened the conversation, and he's still throwing little babies across bedrooms. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, you fucking do know what I'm talking about. I said, well, if you think that, you can get fucked, because I haven't done it. One word led to another, and he and his mate took off. I got my mate that worked with me to go back to Russell Street and get our guns, because I knew that one way or another something was going to happen.
Murphy's instincts were right. A few minutes later, Bennett returned with a loaded shotgun. Murphy feared for his life, and 2 days later, Bennett repeated his threat to kill Murphy during an interview about the confrontation at Victoria Police Headquarters.
When I was going through the interview, he said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, at my time, the time of my making, in the place where I want to, I'm going to blow your fucking head off. You're nothing but a cunt, and that's it. I said, well, fair enough. I said, start it now. He said, no, it'll be when I'm fucking ready.
A slight against Bennett's family was enough to start a lifelong feud between the 2 men. Every time they met, the threat of violence was in the air, even the threat of death.
She goes upstairs, right? And this prick tried to tell me, you bloke smell something? The unmistakable odour of pig shit.
It's pretty funny, Bennett. All right, boys, you know the drum. Up against the wall, let's have you. I said, let's have you, now. Got something to say to me, shitbag? Well, boys, look at this pile of shit. All dressed up like Pox Doctors Clarks. Let's pat him down. You look like a poofter in that jacket, Ray. Must have spent too long in jail taking it up the arse. Got a taste for it, have you? Like to have a piece of me, would you?
I'd love one, Brian.
Did you hear that, Terry? Ray Chuck here just threatened a police officer. You armed, shitbag?
Not until you plan one on me.
You disappoint me, Ray.
You'll get yours.
Yeah?
Not now. Not yet. I want to look you in the eye. I want my face to be the last thing you see before you die.
You're all piss and wind, Bennett. Righto, boys. Stay safe.
You're a dead man, Murphy.
Fucking poofter.
The criminal grapevine buzzed with many rumours about the confrontation in the Rising Sun Hotel, but Murphy states that he did not produce a gun and that it was he who was in fear of being killed by Bennett.
Where was I?
Myself and 2 or 3 other teams of consorters, we used to just lob on hotels to see who was in there drinking. Consorting reports would be made out for them. And it was just a way of policing where criminals were drinking, who they were mixing with, and what kind of crimes that they would be cooking up. We hit the Rising Sun Hotel at the corner of Burnley Street and Swan Street.
It had been the first time that Brian Murphy had seen Ray Bennett for some time. And it quickly became obvious to Murphy that the blood feud of Bennett's instigation was still in place.
And I said, Ray, what's your date of birth? He said, you get fucked. I'm going to tell you now. I'm going to fucking kill you. And I said, whatever you do, don't say it in front of any of these there, because one of them will give you up for what you just said.
He knew that Bennett and his associates were armed. Nevertheless, the hard police officer put these guys up against a wall.
Got something to say to me, shitbag?
And so I started taking the names, and how this bloke puts his foot up and stopped me from being able to walk away from the group. And I said, you get your fucking foot down from there, otherwise you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. And Chuck said, let him go.
And he decided that discretion was the better part of valour, and he should leave the premises. When he went out there, a number of other police joined him, and some of his colleagues suggested that they get the guns out of the boot.
One of the blokes opened the boot of the car and he grabbed the shotgun, giving it to me. He said, well, go and give it to him. I said, mate, if we go in there and give it to them, there'd be 1 million witnesses that weren't even there. I said, but if they give it to us, there'd be no witnesses. And the next time I saw Chuck was at the Undertaker's.
Forensic psychologist Chris Lennings believed Bennett could never let go of the feud because he felt Murphy had crossed the line with his family.
What's happened is that you've got a kind of us and them. You draw the line in the sand and you say that my family are to be protected as part of the deal. I will protect my family. There's that sense of, you can't do this to me. There's this entitlement that comes with being who he is. There's this entitlement that comes with being a fairly serious name in the business. And so you get pretty cranky, angry, well beyond the normal response.
You're a dead man, Murphy.
Because there has been, in a genuine sense, an invasion of who he is and what he's been able to promise he can do.
The two had walked away from many confrontations that had nearly ended in gunfire. With 2 alpha males like Bennett and Murphy, there was always going to be one final act to be played out. Ray Bennett put his crew together for the great Bookie Robbery. The crew included Norman Chops Lee, Laurie Prendergast, Vinnie Mickelson, Ian Carroll and Tony McNamara. All career armed robbers like Bennett. Individually, they were good at what they did, but with Bennett as their leader, they would all soon make history.
Ray Bennett assembled the most experienced, the most reliable armed robbers that he could find, that he could summon. Really He scanned the state.
Some of the men involved in the Bookie robbery were some of the most willing and most probably some of the most intelligent people that have been known as criminals in the state of Victoria.
The Great Bookie Robbery was meticulously planned. Bennett had scoped the place, had wandered around in the Victoria Club, looked at how this could be done.
He studied it and looked at it, and you know, he went up the back stairs and he went up to see the Victoria Club and had a look, and he cased the joint out. And he said, "This is not impossible. This is easy."
And so it was Ray Bennett's job. He considered it important to have the people that worked for him fighting fit by the time they got in to perform the robbery. So they did firearms training, fitness training, and basically skill and drill work on what was required to perform the Great Bookie Robbery.
Months of planning had come to fruition. 6 men struck at the Victorian Racing Club and stole the bookies' money on Tuesday, April 21, 1976. It was the day after Easter holidays. There had been 2 race meetings in Melbourne over the long weekend, and the bookies were carrying a lot more cash than usual.
Easy, Tiger. You and I are going to be friends. Let's take a walk.
Get on the fucking floor!
That means you too, Ambrose. Want to keep your heads down on the ground.
Heads on the ground.
Keep your heads under the table.
Ground shirt, show us your fucking hands. Right, anyone moves, I'll blow your fucking head off. Let's go, let's go.
Keep your heads down.
Let's go, let's go. Come on, let's go.
Tonight, an Australia-wide hunt is continuing for the Victoria Club bandits, so far without success. Official estimates still put the haul at $1.5 million, but there are many in Melbourne who now say the figure could be as high as $5 million.
On the day of the robbery, the men waited, balaclavaed and with guns, waited for the armoured van to arrive with all the bookie bags containing cash. When those bags were brought upstairs, the bookie robbers kicked through the door.
Get on the fucking floor!
That means you too, Ambrose.
Pointed them guns around. One of the men left the second floor and secured the front door of the building.
Easy, Tiger. You and I are going to be friends.
Once they had the cash, they actually took it upstairs to an office that they had leased and kept the money and the guns there, and they didn't go back for it and get their money for a month. From that point, they simply walked out through the front door, and all 6 men joined up later that day for lunch in a pub in South Melbourne to celebrate their success.
Estimates vary on just how much Ray Bennett and his accomplices took from the Great Bookie Robbery. Some believe it was as much as $12 million.
It is known that Norman Lee was found with $40,000 on him. He was ultimately charged with the Great Bookie Robbery, the only man to be charged with it, and he was acquitted. So that's $40,000 that was located.
Well, they said $6 million, but it may be double that because the bookies, of course, don't want to say what they really took that day for fear of paying tax. They'd still be liable for the tax, even if the money was stolen. So people settled on a figure of about $6 million.
It was nearly the perfect crime. There was only one hitch. One of the gang gave himself away.
of the two men that spoke, one was Ray, and the other man said to the bookies and others in the room, "Get down, everybody get down."
Get on the fucking floor!
That means you too, Ambrose.
So Ambrose put his head back down. And Ambrose Palmer said to some people afterwards, he said, "That was Tony McNamara that told me to put my head back down." He said, "I recognise Veggie's voice anywhere." Because he's known Tony McNamara since he's about 14, 15 years old.
No, he didn't tell police. He did tell the Canes, and that set off a chain reaction.
Philip Dunn QC successfully defended the only man ever charged over the great bookie robbery, Norman "Normie" Lee. After Lee was acquitted, he told his barrister details of the elaborate robbery.
And their troubles only began once the robbery was finished, because then a gang of criminals from Sydney, the toe cutters, came down and were after them, and not just their toes.
You had people like the toe cutters in Sydney were snooping around, and this is what's alleged about Brian Kane and his brother. They were trying to put pressure on the Western Suburbs villains and get a part of the action. Well, they were told to go fuck themselves. And this is how the Brian Kane and Les Kane episodes evolved after that.
The great bookie robbery had almost gone too well. The problem for Bennett and his accomplices was what to do with all the money. Gail rarely saw her husband in the wake of the robbery. After Les Kane was murdered in October 1978, Bennett went into hiding and stayed clear of the family home for the safety of his wife and children. The police were closing in. Bennett, Mickelson and Prendergast were charged with the murder of Les Kane in December 1978.
Ray Bennett and two other men were charged with the murder of Les Kane. All three were acquitted at trial. The other two men went into hiding. They were released onto the streets. But Ray Bennett had an outstanding matter, an armed payroll, and he was taken directly into custody, and he was remanded.
Yeah, he was in H Division, and the Canes had all their people down there plotting and planning to stick knives at him in H Division. And that's why he was pleased that I went in the yard with him. Because I went in the yard with him, you're as sweet as a bun. I ran H Division. It's not beat around the bush. I ran H Division. For 10.5 years, I ran the place.
Bennett thought he would be safer in jail than on the outside. He knew that Brian Kane would retaliate for the murder of his brother. Bennett knew the reprisal would come, but who could have expected an attack in a busy courthouse in Melbourne?
Right, well, OK, I need a chat with the prosecutor, so you blokes wait down here with him. I'll let you know when he's needed. He won't give you any trouble, will you, Chuck? Back in the throws. Morning.
This is for you, Ray!
Raymond Patrick Bennett was gunned down in the corridors of the courthouse as he was being led to the 10th court to face armed robbery charges. The killer stood at the top of a flight of stairs and fired 3 shots, hitting Bennett twice in the chest and in one of his hands. As the killer calmly turned and went down the back stairs of the court, Bennett reeled backwards and ran into a courtyard where he collapsed in a pool of blood. The police officers escorting him, after being warned by the killer not to follow, chased Bennett, believing he was trying to escape.
Due to their long-running feud, suspicion for the shooting immediately fell on Detective Brian Murphy.
The previous Sunday, I'd been to Carlton with my wife and one of my daughters for the Italian festival. And we were about to go into La Alba, which was a cafe up there, and a bloke come out and put his head down and just kept going. And I said to my wife, I said, "That's Brian Kane." I said, "He's wearing the same cap as I've got." And which is, anybody can wear them, but he looked more like me. Now, later on, a photo fit was done by witnesses, And one of them was sent to me with, I wonder who this is, in much intimating that I was the bloke that shot Chuck in the court, and have a look at this. I did nothing about it, couldn't have cared less. I knew where I was and what I had done. But a lot of policemen most probably thought that I was behind it.
The shooter was almost undoubtedly Brian Kane. There's virtually no one that disputes that anymore. But the murderer, Brian Kane most likely, was dressed like a solicitor. He was carrying a briefcase. He was wearing a beard at the time. He was wearing gold-rimmed glasses, nicely dressed, waiting for Ray Chuck Bennett to make his appearance that morning. He was the last person anyone would have suspected. There's no doubt that he'd been well schooled on the layout of the magistrate's court. He knew where he had to go and how to get away.
There is no doubt that Brian Kane murdered Ray Bennett. There is some speculation that Brian Kane received assistance from corrupt police in order to leave the scene as quickly as he did and not be captured.
Now there are allegations that the killer was in fact a police officer. I was told about those allegations by high-ranking police officers. I was also told that the Police Internal Investigation Squad, B11, is conducting investigations into 2 police officers in connection with the Bennett slaying.
But we'll never really know about that. What we do know is that Brian Kane shot Ray Bennett because Ray Bennett had shot and killed Brian Kane's brother Les. It was a quid pro quo.
Stephen Barron believes Bennett knew that payback for his life and crimes was coming.
Ray's view of his own life would have been changed by his success in the robbery. He would have known that by making a name for himself, at the same time he was signing his own death warrant. Because if he'd made a name for himself, then someone was always going to be looking to chop him. And the person who got him would then have the same kind of partial attachment to the notoriety that Ray had. The fact that Les Kane's brother killed him outside a courthouse would probably tend to support the view that you can't escape retribution from someone, somewhere, sometime.
Crime doesn't pay. And it didn't pay for Ray Bennett. The great Bookie Robbery, the money had been spent. Some of it had gone offshore to the Philippines to establish bars. Most of it had gone in legal fees for those who wanted to stay out of the reach of the justice system, or indeed had gone to pay off police to take the heat off them. Out of the $3 or $4 million that was stolen, there's virtually nothing left after Ray Bennett was killed.
His nemesis, Brian Murphy, was to have one final face-to-face with Ray Chuck Bennett.
The police department gave my squad the job of guarding the body down at the Undertaker's, because they reckoned that the Kanes were going to again chop his hands and feet off and both him with his wife. And I was looking at him, I thought, well, what a waste of a life. Here you are, the age you are, and your wife and kids left behind. What was it all worth?
Despite being shot in broad daylight in front of a small army of police and lawyers, the murder of Ray Chuck Bennett remains unsolved today. What everyone knows is that Brian Kane was his killer. What remains unknown is the extent to which Kane was assisted in Bennett's murder. Ray Bennett, the gunman, arch thief and criminal mastermind, was finally outsmarted. He died at just 32 years of age. His wife Gail and sons were left to pick up the pieces. The man they loved, a man who lived by the gun, had died by the gun.